Israel normalized ties with the UAE, Sudan, and Bahrain this year. Israeli media is saying that there was a shadowy agreement between Netanyahu and the United Arab Emirates prior to the normalization deal. It says that this might be similar to Netanyahu's submarine scandal with Germany.
There is no base to say that there were negotiations on this issue. There was no condition on behalf of the UAE to sell them F-35s as part of the peace deal. Only after the deal was signed, the Americans told us we should consider this matter.
In that case, close aides and friends of his were involved in bribery for the purchase of submarines and missile-equipped boats. In this case, however, it was convincing Netanyahu's ally in the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump, to sell the Emirates F-35 warplanes. Not everyone's happy about the deal. Many in Israel believe that selling F-35 warplanes to the UAE gives it a military edge that only Israel enjoys. And the Arab Israelis believe the so-called Abraham Accords, also known as the normalization deal, are apartheid in nature. It seems that at home in Israel, Netanyahu isn't being totally honest about his normalization deals with Arab countries. Israeli media shine light on the fact that Netanyahu has given his agreement to U.S. the sale of F-35 fighter jets to the UAE as a big incentive for the country to sign a peace deal with Israel. At first, these claims were dismissed and labeled by Netanyahu and his supporters as fake news. But he recently admitted that the U.S. is planning to sell the advanced aircrafts to Abu Dhabi, and Israel will not object. Netanyahu, in his defense, claimed the arms deal between the U.S. and the UAE was made after the normalization agreement had been signed. Israeli military minister Benny Gantz, however, implied that Netanyahu lied to the Israeli military and the negotiations over the normalization deal, which included the sale of the jets, had been conducted behind the backs of Israel's defense establishment. Opposition lawmaker and former military minister Moshe Yaalon said the same thing happened during the purchase of submarines from Germany, with Netanyahu completely ignoring the defense ministry's opinion on the matter. It should be noted that this submarine affair with Germany is a big deal in Israel. The high-profile Case 3000 investigation has accused several close associates of Netanyahu, but not the premier himself, on suspicion that they received illicit funds as part of a massive graft scheme in the shekel purchase of naval vessels and submarines from German shipbuilder ThyssenKrupp. Some have called it the largest suspected graft scandal in Israel's history. Israeli prosecutors are reportedly considering opening yet another criminal graft investigation against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this time in the so-called submarine affair, citing dramatic new information.
I think the price of Israel wasn't, how to say that, if you think about what they did in the agreement, it's to make a solidarity between these three countries, and even Sudan were inside this solidarity with America, and all against Iran. This is the main issue in these agreements. But other thing that it was declared for the people in Israel, for example, or maybe the people in these countries, that it is agreement for business or for other things. I think that Netanyahu maybe he needs the business or the Israel between these countries and Israel, but moreover they want to make a prize for Trump, who is now out, and Netanyahu to say that we did something in this time, and to give legitimation for the F-25 war airplanes or how you say it, it's about selling these airplanes for these countries. Because Netanyahu has trouble with his people about the similar deal with Germany about the submarines and missile equipment boats, which was secret until they discover it, and he couldn't make this deal for Egypt and Germany and agree with this deal. So now he has the legitimation about these deals also between Emirates and USA.
On social media, the conversation was tense. Heisenberg says maybe Netanyahu can sell the invisible planes with invisible money. Pierre says it was never a peace plan. Thompson says he will support the sale to give all parties the ability to defend its sovereignty, or Israel can return the advanced weapon systems the U.S. gave Israel.
אני, את האמת, לא תומך בנורמליזציה, בגלל שאני לא חושב שזה תורם לפתרון הסופי לסכסוך מדינת ישראל עם המדינות שסביבה, ובמיוחד עם הצד הפלסטיני. זה לא נותן פתרון סופי לסכסוך, אז זה לא נחשב לדבר שתורם לשקט באזור.
תלוי. מדינות שנעשה איתם יחסים מסודרים והסכמים תקינים ברי קיימא, אז יכולים לקבל תמריצים, אבל תמריצים מותנים באופן, איך אני אקרא לזה, ההתנהגות שלהם. זאת אומרת, מדינות שתומכות ומדינות שה-DNA שלהם הוא תוקפני ופניהם לא לשלום, אז איתם גם לא עושים יחסי נורמליזציה, אבל בטח ובטח לא תמריצים. אם ניתן להגיע איתם ליחסים נורמטיביים, אז אפשר לעשות את הדברים בשלבים. זאת אומרת, לא יכול להיות מצב שכתוצאה מיחסי נורמליזציה נסכן את המדינה שלנו.
תשמעי, עניין השלום היום לדאבוני הרב, לצערי הרב, נהיה עניין של סחר ומכר. הכוונה, אם אני רוצה לכונן שלום עם מדינה אחרת, המדינה האחרת חייבת לתת לי משהו. ולפי דעתי, כן, צריך. למשל, אביא לך דוגמה, למשל סודן. היום סודן היא חותרת לקרות הסכם שלום עם ישראל. סודן, אם את חוזרת להיסטוריה של סודן, כל סודן, מי ששלט בסודן הם רודנים עד היום הזה, והיא הייתה ביצה של טרור. והיום סודן, בגלל המצב האקונומי שלה, הכלכלי הקשה שלה, היא רוצה לצאת מהביצה הזאת, להתפתח כמו שאר המדינות. איך היא עושה דבר כזה? היא יכולה להתקרבת לארצות הברית. ואיך היא יכולה להתקרב לארצות הברית? אז המדרך, קרש הקפיצה שלה, היא ישראל. לכן היא רוצה לקרות הסכם שלום עם ישראל.
The leadership that will make a real democracy, not what's happening right now. That he kills all the democratic institutes and he makes what he wants, like a king. and that's what we are against.
I think what has happened is that Israel normalized relations with Bahrain and the UAE and Sudan and now also Morocco because it's part of the United States reactionary alliance. The US wants to have an alliance of states that are with it militarily, primarily militarily, and then also economically. So you have countries like the United States, Israel, Bahrain, the UAE, countries like Brazil, countries like Hungary, some of the European countries, together in what I think of as a very reactionary alliance of the most backward states when it comes to political morality. Netanyahu may have objected at first to the sale of F-35s to the UAE, but he knows, and the United States knows, that Israel has nuclear weapons. First of all, this is basically, this alliance is good for all of them for military sales. It's a sales alliance. It's going to boost military sales monumentally. Secondly, these states cannot possibly attack Israel or become militarily superior to Israel because they don't have nuclear weapons.
Per usual, we will sit down with two artists to discuss their views and personal experiences. We have also prepared a couple of recommendations for you that I hope you will find useful.
Netanyahu is also under fire for striking a normalization deal with Sudan at the behest of the U.S. taking Sudan off its list of terrorism sponsors. Sudan has been under sanctions, and by removing it from the list, Sudan would be relieved of its financial burdens and can trade freely with the U.S. and other countries. Sudan believes that it is the biggest winner of the deal. According to Sudan, Khartoum would have had to wait a year to be delisted as state sponsor of terrorism, says General Abdel Fattah Burhan, head of the ruling Sovereign Council. For Netanyahu's right-wing supporters, the normalization with Arab countries can cost them greatly. First of all, Netanyahu has promised that he will not for the time being annex the occupied West Bank, which was a major campaign promise. He had wanted to annex it and promised to do so for years, despite public outcry from the international community. From the Israeli rights perspective, the main purpose of these agreements is to solidify its power and to further weaken the Palestinian struggle against occupation and apartheid. The Israeli Arabs reflect on this because they are treated as second-class citizens. In fact, the so-called nation-state law institutionalized racism and apartheid against Israeli Arabs. They believe that the Abraham Accords are essentially an alliance of Israel with its apartheid against Palestinians, Bahrain and its Saudi-backed Sunni oppression of the Shia majority, and the UAE, where Emirati citizens live with 8 million foreigners with no rights.
As I said, it is apartheid countries. They are not democratic. They have people there as a second level citizens or something like this. So when they make these deals without talking about Palestinians problems, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, not talking about a solution also for these agreements, and also Israel has the Arab Palestinian, and after the law, nation country law, which make the Arab Palestinian Israeli citizens in a second level, it's like making legitimation for this apartheid regime. It's putting the it's saying for the whole world, okay, here we have in Bahrain, in Emirat, in Saudi, we have also like these people who we can treat Israeli Palestinian citizens the same. They can't sign it. They can't support it because it didn't speak about a solution for the Palestinian. It didn't speak about the nation country law, which make the Palestinian people in Israel as other citizens, Jewish citizens. So they can't. They didn't sign it. They don't agree with it. About these agreements under the law. But now, when it's under the table, and now when it is on the table and need the support of the lawmakers, there is many differences between these agreements. In the deal of the century, there were talks about solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Was this solution fair for the Palestinian or not? But the Palestinian conflict was in the middle of this agreement. The agreement between Emirat, Saudi, Bahrain, and Israel and Sudan, there was nothing about Palestinians. Also, what is similar between them, and if there is something secret or shadowy about Palestinian, in both agreements, Palestinians are not part of these agreements. They don't share, they don't support, they don't have any idea about what is going between them, and then they want the Palestinian to accept it.
On social media, the conversation was tense. Ruana says normalization with Israel is to recognize the right of the thief who stole your brother's house, expelled him and his family to the street, and you open your house to rob you too and expel you with your family later. Motherland says shame on these countries that normalize with Israel. CC Cannon says, I think you better start backing as far away as possible from the corrupt Trump administration.
הרי טראמפ הוא עם נתניהו כמובן, הם אלה שהובילו את המהלך שנעשה מעל לשולחן כמו שאמרתי קודם, אבל אנחנו לא שוכחים שההסכמים האלו והמשא ומתן לפני זה, המשא ומתן הסודי, היה גם לפני טראמפ וגם לפני נתניהו, אז טראמפ ונתניהו, אני חושב שהם היו רק הווטרינה של ההסכמים האלה.
אני חושבת שנתניהו לא עושה שום דבר טוב. אז אני לא יכולה לשפוט את המעשים שלו, כי אני לא באמת... ולכן אני לא יודעת מה הוא עשה ומה הוא לא עשה, ואם זה טוב או לא טוב.
לפי דעתי כן. זה תלוי במדינות ולא תלוי באנשים ולא תלוי בשליטים. כן, צריך להיות מותנית. אם אני אעשה נורמליזציה, צריך קודם כל לא לפגוע בי כמדינה, בריבונות שלי. למשל, היום אנחנו רואים שהסכם השלום בין האמירויות לבין ישראל, אנחנו שומעים על סחר בבני אדם, על זנות, על סמים, על מחתרות. צריך שכל מדינה, לפני שהיא קוראת את הסכם שלום, צריך קודם כל לבדוק את העניין הזה מכל הבחינות, מכל האספקטים, ואחר כך לחתום על הסכם. שישמור כמובן על הריבונות שלה.
I'm protesting here my fourth time, and I'm protesting because of the trial of the Prime Minister, that is trying to avoid it, and we want him to quit, to resign.
If you just go back to 2018 and look at Israel's nation-state law that was passed in it, what we see is a law that says Jews alone have the right of self-determination within Israel, whose boundaries are not defined in this law, and that Jews alone can settle the land as a form of almost spiritual national redemption. In addition, it makes Hebrew the official language of Israel and relegates Arabic to a secondary status. That means Palestinians living within Israel proper, as it's called, as well as in the Palestinian territories that are occupied, these people are they're not just second-class citizens. They're third, fourth, or fifth-class citizens. They do not have equal rights with the Jewish Israeli public. They have no right to self-determination. They have no right to settle land owned primarily by the State of Israel, the Jewish National Fund. They have no right to make Arabic the primary language of their daily lives. I mean, it is the primary language, but it's considered secondary.
Some compare the Abraham Accords with the nation-state law that was passed in 2018 by the Israeli Knesset. Many compare it to legalizing apartheid, as it legally made all Arab citizens second-class citizens. Just last July, Israeli Knesset rejected an amendment to this nation-state law to include a clause guaranteeing the equality of all citizens. Israelis now feel that Netanyahu lied to them and that they're giving up too much instead of what they were promised, nothing for normalization with Arab countries. Israelis have always sought recognition and acceptance from the Arab world without reciprocity. Can Netanyahu admit the real price of normalization for Israel? That's one question Netanyahu's opponents in Israel are asking. Here is the news making the press in Israel. Ynet News. Israel's coronavirus czar says a third Israel lockdown definitely on the agenda. Israel's new coronavirus czar, Professor Nachman Ash, said that Israel should prepare another year of dealing with the pandemic, warning that a third lockdown is definitely on the agenda. The Jerusalem Post. A young couple from Beersheba experiencing financial difficulties due to the coronavirus pandemic allegedly turned their apartment into a warehouse for storing drugs and weapons. Israel police investigators uncovered various weapons and explosive devices in their apartment. They also found other substances, including dozens of bags suspected to contain marijuana, on a digital scale that raised the suspicion of drug trafficking as well. The Times of Israel. Protesters demand Supreme Court allow launch of official probe into massive graft scandal that has ensnared Netanyahu associates. The affair, also known as Case 3000, revolves around allegations of scheme in the multi-billion shekel state purchase of the naval vessels from German shipbuilder ThyssenKrupp. The case has already resulted in indictments against several close associates of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as high-ranking military officials, but not the premier himself. Globes. IBM Israel is laying off dozens of employees in its sales division. The cutbacks come just 6 months after the company shed dozens of employees from its development center in Tel Aviv as part of a reorganization of the company's storage products. The latest cuts are also part of a global streamlining process in which thousands of jobs are being cut worldwide.